Welcome to Burned Out, a post-mortem analysis. I've noticed patterns across multiple companies. Some of these companies have even claimed they're leading the charge against burnout, while exploiting the real problem of burnout solely for PR benefits like public goodwill, desirability among potential hiring candidates, or overcompensating for internal flaws such as unrealistic on-call expectations like the all-too-common one, treating on-call, that's nights and weekends with a cell phone by your side in the event of an emergency, as free labor. The ability for our respective organizations to do this is limited only by our ability as professionals to accept it as normal and accept or stay in these roles without improving them. This is a systemic issue. That means it's everyone's problem and there's no single person to place the blame with. There are enablers, there are perpetrators, there are bystanders, but it spans organizations and it spans company cultures. I think at the very least, I'd hate to see 100 years of labor movement progress diminish solely because we, as stewards of the world's technology, lack the self-discipline or self-confidence required to stand up for our well-being and professional sustainability. I've had multiple people tell me that I'm risking my job or even my career by studying burnout, creating this talk, and presenting it publicly. I'm not here to burn bridges. I'm here to construct new ones by stimulating what I believe is much needed open discussion around this issue. I'm perfectly fine with you disagreeing with all or some of what I'll be speaking about, but I believe it's our responsibility to ensure we face the issue and try to do something about it. The fact that this is considered a subject which we should self-censor is a bit tragic in itself. I believe that to an extent, this indicates we've devalued ourselves as individuals, and now we're collectively suffering for it. But we're too concerned about the perceived repercussions around fixing it to do anything about it. It's time to make some changes, and not everyone's going to like them. My stance on that is simple. There were people who didn't like the switch to a 40-hour work week too. Good news for them though, that's quickly becoming history now as well. I informally call this slide Why I Start My Personal Introspection in 2007 and 2008. First, some psychology. In 1967, two psychiatrists named Thomas Holmes and Richard Rahe examined the medical records of over 5,000 medical patients as a way to determine whether stressful events might cause illnesses. Patients were asked to tally a list of 43 life events based on a relative score. A positive correlation was found between their life events and their illnesses. Their results were published as the Social Readjustment Rating Scale, or SRRS, known more commonly as the Holmes and Rahe Stress Scale. Subsequent validation has supported the links between stress and illness. Like all statistics, the results of this scale can lie. For example, a major holiday is worth 12 life change units, and a divorce is 73 units. According to this scale, which is not logarithmic, a divorce is only 6 times harder than preparing for Thanksgiving. That said, it's still a useful tool for gauging the relative stress level at any point in your life. The text is small to fit the whole scale, but any items you see highlighted in bold, I experienced between 2007 and 2008. Here are the cliff notes of this era. I was 22. From August till December of 2007, I was studying to earn a CCNA certification with the hope that it would help me land a real systems administration job with a pay bump. I didn't have any real experience in networking prior. I figured go big or go home, and it worked. I earned my CCNA in December of 2007. Outstanding personal achievement, 28 units. I was fortunate in that I had a boss who had my career goals in mind and knew I wasn't satisfied in the role I had prior to getting this certification. He immediately gave me a job as a systems administrator and a substantial pay bump. Change in responsibilities at work, 29 units. Change to different line of work, 36 units. Change in working hours or conditions, 20 units. And I figured, better to invest my newfound income in a house than waste it on stuff I don't really need, right? So I purchased my first home in March of 2008. Major mortgage, 32 units. Then I moved in. Change in residence, 20 units. Then I realized renovations are expensive, and living in a house you're fixing up isn't really as nice as living with your parents. Change in financial state, 38 units. Change in living conditions, 25 units. Now, all of these events were fairly ambitious, but they were also manageable. And if you're counting, you know that the running total is 228 units. Then, after all this fairly ambitious but manageable stuff, came what I can only describe as the single most impactful event in my entire life. In June 2008, my mother's terminal illness began to take a drastic toll on her health. Change in health of a family member, 44 units. And in July of 2008, she passed away. Death of a close family member, 63 units. To put it simply, if the homes in Rahi scale were a contest, I'd have won it with a grand total of 335 units over a duration of only 1 year. The year duration spanning from August 2007 to August 2008 was such a dramatic change over any previous year that it's undeniably the beginning of my personal burnout story. If you feel burned out, I encourage you to think back to a time in your life that was particularly stressful. We live in a culture that celebrates personal achievement. So it could be college, it could be a major industry award or contribution. It could be a life or death issue like it was in my case, or it could be a job promotion or a pay bump with more responsibilities. It's possible that if you're like me, this was the beginning of your experience with notably high levels of stress. The goal of this exercise is not to wallow or overly focus on these negative events, but to acknowledge their impact on your physical and mental health, and to think about who you were before they impacted you, who you emerged as, run a quick mental comparison between the two, and then keep the good stuff like the life lessons and the positive motivators like learning, while working as hard as you can to get rid of the bad, like purposeless anxiety or negative motivators like fear. Stress itself does not inherently come from negative causes. There are good stressors that create a state of eustress, and bad stressors that create a state of distress. There's a sliding scale between the amount and intensity of the various stressors in our lives that goes from utter boredom, or the boredom zone, to unhealthy distress. The goal is not to eliminate stress, but like most things, to live with a moderate level of it. We want to be challenged. We want to enjoy the work we do. We want to have sovereignty over our career and personal health. When any of these things are exploited, overindulged, or taken away entirely, that's when we leave the habitable zone called eustress, and we must make changes. Now, some of these options are clearly better than others, but all of these involve some combination of dopamine, which comes from solving a problem or overcoming a challenge. Many mistakenly think this is a reward chemical that gives a sense of satisfaction. This isn't entirely true. Dopamine simply reinforces rewarding behavior on a neurological level. Eat that slice of pizza? Dopamine. Eat 10 slices? You'll start to see diminishing returns. It's unexpectedly pleasurable behavior, novel behavior, something that breaks from the norm. That increases dopamine levels in the brain. When that behavior becomes normal, dopamine decreases. That said, if that behavior is eliminated entirely, dopamine can drop dramatically. Ultimately, this means that all things we do to, quote, feel better have diminishing returns, and moderation is critical. Next on the list is endorphins. These come from physical exertion and produce a pain-relieving effect. After that, there's oxytocin. This comes from lasting relationships and love. Then we have serotonin. This regulates anxiety, happiness, and overall mood. Surprisingly to many, about 80 to 90% of your serotonin is produced in the gastrointestinal tract. The verdict is still out on what effect our dietary habits have on serotonin levels. But at the risk of sounding like a fitness guru, a healthy diet is probably a good idea. And last but not least, we have norepinephrine and epinephrine. Fight or flight, adrenaline rush, all of these come from norepinephrine or epinephrine. Anxiety disorders simply mean constantly feeling this adrenaline rush without external stimuli. The problem, unbeknownst to me at the time, was that my hobbies and my job were beginning to align. My coping mechanism was to keep my mind busy. It always had been. I would go to work and I would work on complex network infrastructures, and then I would come home and I would tweak the configuration on my home network, the same way that I had for years. I would go to work and I would deploy installs of Sal's laptops. Then I would come home and hop between Linux distributions in my home lab, the same way I had for years. I would go to work and I would help coworkers with desktop support issues. Then I would come home and I would help my family and friends with desktop support issues, the same way I had for years. I was eating more than ever and I didn't even realize it. And I was slowly gaining weight, 70 pounds in total to date, but finally dropping. I lost a lean distance runner's physique in the name of intellectual pursuits, and to be perfectly honest with myself, financial reward. Now, despite all this, previous to this, I wasn't a quote real sysadmin. I had worked non-technical or minimally technical jobs, and I challenged myself to learn about tech on my own time. And finally, I had achieved my goal. I had suffered from imposter syndrome, and finally it was over. Finally, I was legit. Except imposter syndrome, according to the be-all, end-all of human knowledge, Wikipedia, is the inability to internalize one's own accomplishments and a persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud. It's the opposite of overconfidence. It's what occurs when you think you're capable of is but a fraction of what you're actually capable of. For years of my adolescence, I had poured myself into multiple hobbies, including musicianship, running, and even the study of behavioral psychology for fun. Despite this, I knew deep down that I had friends who were much more naturally adept programmers than I, much more mathematical thinkers than I, much more focused on one skill to the point where mastery wasn't out of the question for them. My inability to hone in and master one skill was the chip on my shoulder. I had one friend in particular that I went through high school with who I really respected. After school, he worked designing microprocessors. Then he just decided to jump into the financial industry and is now living in Europe, where he shot up as a VP at one of the largest banks in the world. Who does that? Why couldn't I achieve the same success with hard work and dedication? You see, imposter syndrome and a competitive nature, they go hand in hand. And they don't go away once you achieve a goal or get the gig. They don't vanish once you earn the respect of your colleagues. They don't go away when Google calls you in for an interview. They don't go away when you start a blog that people read or contribute to open source software that people actually use. There's still that little voice in your head saying, you're not legit yet. Keep trying. Imposter syndrome can make us slaves to our own psychological imperfections. Add to this our new, quote, Kaizen culture of constant improvement, and it can feed a life of perpetual stress. I was stuck in a loop. Go to work, immerse myself in complex tech, come home, immerse myself in even more complex tech, and I wore it as a badge of honor until it finally caught up with me. I had survived immense personal tragedy. Why wouldn't I be proud of my ability to march on in spite of this? Our American culture worships this behavior, and so I toiled, day in and day out. The goal was to get to the point where I hit that imaginary threshold, where I would not feel like a fraud anymore. A day without overcoming challenging technical issue or learning something new was a wasted day. Startup culture has a way of attracting a combination of people who are vastly overconfident in their abilities and type A people with imposter syndrome. Somewhere in the middle are the folks who possess a more healthy balance of confidence and self-doubt. And they tend to last the longest. I know because I worked in this culture for over 5 years of my career. It's a culture obsessed with burning the midnight oil and life hacks. Founders, though undoubtedly daring in their entrepreneurial pursuits, are too often in it to get in and get out young, even if it means leaving a trail of husks that were once bright, motivated employees in their wake. After you interview, you're told something along these lines. We know what you are and what you want because we are motivated and driven and smart and young and of limitless potential just like you. You want complex problems to sink your teeth into, and we've got them. We've also got $1,000 Erman Miller Aeron chairs waiting for you. We have standing desks and chefs on site. We'll give you everything you need to be the best you can be. When you work with us, not for us, you're somebody who has made it. If you don't work for us, you're one of the regular people. A regular person who punches the clock at 5 p.m. and watches syndicated television after work and does the same thing day in and day out. But we aren't that. We're special, and so are you. Let's change the world together, making... And then typically they insert a non-world changing widget here. Now, of course I'm exaggerating a little toward the end there, but generally, this sentiment is not very far from accurate. There is an appeal to your ego and your psychological imperfections. Combine that with the American mythos of the startup, the Apple Garage, the HP Garage, the folks who started at Google when it was a 5-person team. It's very difficult to say no to an opportunity like this. And the end result is entire organizations that are assembled based in large part on overconfidence, imposter syndrome, and in both cases, an insatiable desire to achieve regardless of the personal toll it may take. If you're overconfident, you'll say, exactly, I am great and I deserve this. And if you've got imposter syndrome, you'll say, if I don't take this opportunity, I'll never be legit. This is my chance. At worst, it's a flawed system based on the unsustainable use of human intellect and drive, and it's not sustainable for anyone except those running the systems themselves, who through all of the grueling work enjoy the privilege of a possibility that they may be able to retire young after a few years of amassing great fortune. Early on, I developed very real physical symptoms of dangerous stress levels, serious physical health issues, a crippling panic and anxiety disorder, something I never would have imagined I'd experience firsthand. A fun assortment of other ailments, which I'll spare you the details on, and finally, mild depression as a result of all those fun health problems and constant nagging imposter syndrome. In later years, a few other chronic autoimmune issues began to creep up on me that may or may not have been contributed to by my excessive devotion to pushing myself beyond healthy limits. It took me a minute to say all of this, but the net impact of unsustainable work on my life has been dramatic and negative. It's taken a ton of time and strength to overcome these issues that may have been avoidable had I said no to being on call 24/7 through most of my 20s. I could have worked less than 9 to 10 hours per day. I could have not mentally allowed myself to get so wrapped up in my work. I could have done a better job maintaining hobbies instead of letting technical work consume my time and blur the line between work and play. I could have been more demanding of the people who were supposed to be my leaders, that repeatedly spread messages that anything less than perfection of my craft was mediocrity at best, and that didn't belong on their team. It took me too long to realize I didn't have the time to waste on teams led by people who chain-smoked to cope with the immense stress they were under and patronized senior members of their own team in front of subordinates. It wasn't leadership, it was veiled bullying, and I'm by no means soft, having been through quite a bit of real tragedy. But I was too inexperienced, and it took too long for me to reject bad leadership by moving on, and in my delay, I paid a price. My identity had become systems administrator, or systems engineer, or DevOps engineer, or ops engineer, instead of a guy who enjoyed computers, musicianship, writing, teaching, and just plain old goofing off with video games. I was giving up myself for my job. Burnout doesn't show up immediately or to an entire team at once, which makes it an easy problem to dismiss as isolated and difficult to recognize and fix. Slowly, an organization will bleed. The first sign will be employees beginning to leave voluntarily for greener pastures. It's often around this time other employees will become cynical, lose the motivation to perform at their best. Then they're let go as new blood comes in to carry the, quote, increased load, when really per individual contributions have simply decreased. Then, without intervention or obvious financial repercussions to the organization, the cycle repeats. Here are things that aren't solutions. Seriously, when is blaming the victim ever a good idea? Then you have hard firing, soft firing, and replacing the victim. Hard firing is when you're handed your walking papers in a nice awkward exit interview with HR. Soft firing is when you're, quote, promoted sideways, also known as out of the way, and someone else is put in your exact old role, maybe just under a different title to keep things from being too obvious. Anonymous satisfaction surveys fail because people never fully feel anonymous at work. In fact, and this is my personal opinion, I'm not entirely sure there is a good way to get a read on what employees are really feeling, other than being a very empathetic and insightful leader. So, enough exposition. I love to self-righteously say, complaining is easy and fixing is hard. So how do we fix it? I will be talking about solutions. We must introspect. We can be self-righteous, we can be hypocritical. We love to perpetuate the myth that we're the leaders in an industry that refuses to accept the status quo while we speak matter-of-factly or even celebrate flaws in our collective makeup that have evolved to become tropes, such as the grumpy person in the dark room. I would probably be hiding in the dark drinking too if I were forced to use that keyboard every day. The annoyed person who rolls their eyes at everyone, Somewhere along the line, we decided, whether through our individual actions or lack of action against it, to appropriate antisocial behavior as a cultural trait. I don't know about you, but to me, snarky t-shirts that say "No, I will not fix your computer," or "There are only 10 types of people in this world, those that understand binary and those that don't," are a hallmark of a junior engineer's wardrobe. It is my sincere hope that in time we will grow to limit the amount of snark and try to teach each other. This sort of behavior gives us a bad reputation, and moreover, it gives an excuse to our management teams to treat us like antisocial children that need to be hidden away. Let's do ourselves a huge favor and not give people reasons to set our desks up in wiring closets. Vitamin D is a good thing anyway. And then finally, you have the actually person. This aligns somewhat with antisocial behavior. This is the person who insists on things being right and would probably describe themselves as a technical stickler, usually meaning they want things done their favorite way. These are the folks on the team who say "actually" a lot. For example, in a team meeting, someone may say, "Jenkins is a good build system for this project. All in favor say aye." And the team will say, "Aye, aye, aye, aye." Then comes the technical stickler. "Actually, we should use Rundeck." And the Scrum Master or the meeting organizer will say, "But Rundeck isn't for builds, it's for task running." And the actually person will say, "Actually, we can use it for builds too." The fact is, anyone on the team who knows about Jenkins and Rundeck also knows that, yeah, you can use Rundeck to deploy if you really wanted to. And we get it, you clearly like Rundeck, but you're wearing your team down when in every planning meeting, you find another minor implementation detail to harp on just for kicks. Great teams thrive on the ease of establishing consensus efficiently. This doesn't mean blind agreement, it just means the ability to quickly make decisions on the best way to move forward. It's the little events like this that add up and contribute to team-wide burnout. To continue the above example, why not both? Why not use Jenkins for continuous integration and continuous deployment, and Rundeck for the centralized organization of repeatable tasks that would otherwise be spread across cron tabs on multiple servers? We get emotionally invested in our work, to a fault. This emotional investment affects how we interact with others. Everything has a cause. Trying to understand the cause of a problem does not exasperate the problem. It helps us move closer to a lasting solution. I was told once by a manager that by bringing up a cultural problem, I was making it bigger than it actually is. I said it then and I'll say it now. This is an excuse for a lack of leadership ability required to listen and act on a cultural or technical issue. I was giving my manager a small gift in the form of insight into the mechanics of their team, and instead of noting it, they encouraged me to keep my mouth shut. A wise leader listens impartially and acts accordingly. This person didn't even want to listen. It's never a good idea to suggest that by bringing up and talking about a problem, we're somehow making it worse. The thing about cultural problems is they tend to grow when they're ignored. If you're a leader, whether informally or formally, try to listen first, then act. It seems so obvious, but we miss it all the time. There's an irony in worshiping metrics and monitoring while totally ignoring your own or your team's physical and mental health. So how do we incite change? The first thing we need to do is recognize that many of our commonly held beliefs are wrong. These are the lies we tell ourselves. Then we need to learn a little bit about human psychology, and finally, how we regain control of our own psychology and fix things. Here are the lies we tell ourselves. Systems and operations engineers really just need to learn how to write proper code. Shell scripting doesn't count. Though it's tempting, look at any culture where one group of people acts as if another group of people is somehow lacking and needs to be more like them, and watch how it turns out. It's usually ugly before it's beautiful. I am a systems engineer and I write code, and I still find this sentiment uncouth and an invitation for strife. Systems people became systems people because they like working on systems things. If they wanted to be developers, they would have become developers, and many of us have. I wouldn't ask or expect my mechanic to design and build a car, and I don't hold it against them that they want to be great mechanics. Somebody needs to maintain the vehicles after they're produced, flaws and all, and sold to the masses. Here's the rub. It's not only that we aren't developers, it's that too many developers don't know or care about good systems engineering practices. And too many folks responsible for the budget think they can save money by having developers assume operations responsibilities. I always joke, there's a reason it's called DevOps and not OpsDev. Though it's sold as a closer collaboration between developers and operations, what it has often turned out to be is development teams assuming the responsibilities of operations without any prior operations or systems experience, and lead developers assuming the role of senior systems engineers. We operate under the false, that's read lazy, assumption that coders do it right and we just need to adopt sprints and scrums in all things agile. Sure, they may be able to automate the installation of a web server or set up a monitoring system, but what about understanding disk I/O limitations or the implications of different RAID levels in a physical infrastructure? What about all of the painful, less glamorous elements of systems administration, like knowing how to debug a faulty IPMI or ILO interface? These are finely honed skills that take years to develop, and they don't go away with automation. In fact, I'd argue that having a dev team assuming infrastructure automation responsibilities without the same number of operations folks involved, it's a recipe for future pain. I'm not implying that developers are incapable of these system skills. What I'm implying is that we need a more balanced approach if we're going to be sustainable. DevOps, like Agile, went from being a completely valid methodology of collaboration to a cost-saving approach. Like all oversimplified ideologies, they often take on the flaws of the people adopting them. You can only trim a technical team so much before you start to see negative effects like poorly written infrastructure automation code that doesn't cover common systems level error states, or eventually burnout among an engineering team that is stretched too thin. I believe the term full stack engineer is a myth. It's a marketing term. It's used by recruiting teams to search for people who can do everything from front-end development to speccing out a server. And what you end up with is a person who can do a little bit of everything. A true full-stack engineer is a rare beast indeed, while people claiming to be full-stack engineers are not so rare, because in a competitive job market, it's a quick way to get into an interview and maybe even a job if you're able to convince the interviewer that you do know every part of their tech stack at a place you haven't even worked at yet. The reality? This is an appeal to the ego of overconfident candidates I spoke about earlier. I know a lot about networking. I could design a solid network infrastructure from scratch. I know how to configure a server remotely. I know how to deploy operating systems remotely. I know how to spin up a container or many with an orchestration layer. I know a lot about Chef and Puppet and Ansible and automation. I know a lot about Linux and BSD, even Windows. I know how to monitor disks with Smart. I know how to read systems logs to troubleshoot an issue or trace a process. I know how to use IPMI and ILO to access servers remotely. I know the best orientation to install hardware in a data center cabinet. I know enough Ruby, Python, Shell, even JavaScript to take advantage of any number of APIs that are relevant to my job. I could probably figure out how to write my own API in a few days with the help of a framework like Swagger.io. I could walk around calling myself a full stack engineer, but the truth is, between my imposter syndrome and the very real fact that there will always be more I don't know than I do, I refuse to call myself a full-stack engineer. If anything, I'm an expert generalist. That's the most realistic way I can describe myself, and I suspect many of you would say the same. Finally, sure, we have automation and VMs and containers and microservices, but all of this runs on hardware. Even if we don't manage the hardware, someone does. Someone who identifies as a systems person. The cloud is just somebody else's computer. Either way, if we're systems people, odds are we do manage the hardware, and the network, and the inventory, and the purchasing, and the updates to all of these things, and the downtime needed for these updates, and the automation of these updates, and all of the bugs at every one of these aforementioned layers. Good systems administration is orchestration, and it's more akin to a management role than it is to a development role. So what exactly does that mean? It means infrastructure isn't magic. It's not an API call. It isn't clean. In fact, systems work is rarely glamorous and it's almost always dirty work. I'd like to share an excerpt from an article I recently read on the subject of burnout, which is included in the links at the end of this presentation. Burnout didn't become a recognized diagnosis until 1974, when the German-American psychologist Herbert Freudenberger applied the term to the increasing number of cases he encountered of physical or mental collapse caused by overwork or stress. The relationship to stress and anxiety is crucial, for it distinguishes burnout from simple exhaustion. Run a marathon, paint your living room, Catalog your collection of tea caddies, and the tiredness you experience will be infused with a deep satisfaction and faintly haloed in smugness. Feelings that confirm you've discharged your duty to the world for at least the remainder of the day. The exhaustion experienced in burnout combines an intense yearning for this state of completion with the tormenting sense that it cannot be attained, that there is always some demand or anxiety or distraction which cannot be silenced. Systems and operations engineering is dirty work in that it's too often triggered by something being broken, not an opportunity to build something new from start to finish. This, of course, isn't unique to our role, but we definitely experience it as opposed to easily planned project work, and it's frequent enough to note. You can't box our kind of work into segments like project managers love to do because it's unpredictable. Being in systems is less like being a mathematician and more like being a deep-sea boat captain. You plot a course, but you will be doing a lot of adjusting along the way, and freak waves will come and they will ruin your days and nights. A reliable infrastructure takes time. It takes experience. And it takes sleep. And sleep deprivation is not a badge of honor. The fact that I'm even dedicating a portion of this talk to the benefits of normal human sleep patterns is quite telling. Any company or team that isn't at peace with these truths may be on the fast track to a systemic burnout problem. The second lie that we tell ourselves is that we are solely responsible for our own work-life balance. If we want to work less, we should just work less. I've experienced management that has said this exact phrase verbatim. It was so chilling to me that I wrote it down because I knew it'd be part of a talk someday. The deal was, we get a 40-hour work week. But the subtext was, if we were working more than 40 hours, it was because we weren't good at our job. Not because technical debt had piled up over many years because of rust projects or constant team-wide priority and task switching. Some folks on this team worked 40 hours. The rest made up for the rest of the team until, thanks to burnout, they no longer could sustain the effort with the same energy they had when they originally joined the team. This is a lie, and it absolves management of their duty to ensure their people don't burn out. It's a hallmark of startups who churn through employees and see them as task buckets. If you work for someone like this, try to talk things over with them. Though it can be awkward or difficult, a discussion is always the starting point, not the end. Sometimes they'll see the error in their ways and life will be great. On the other hand, if your manager is an uncompromising lunatic, then you should already be thinking about changing jobs anyway, so I don't need to lecture you about how you should be changing jobs. Leaders set the tone for their team. A person who fails to do this does not operate with the best interest of their team in mind, and is therefore not a leader. So stage a coup or run away. I'm just kidding. Don't stage a coup. It's not very nice, and this isn't a government overthrow. Your best bet is to find greener pastures, of which there exist many. The third lie we tell ourselves, I normally wouldn't do this, but I just need to get this one thing done. This is an exception. For example, I normally wouldn't work late, but I just need to get this chef cookbook committed for review tomorrow. I normally wouldn't check my email on a Sunday, but I really want to make sure I'm ready to hit the ground running on Monday. Isn't it weird how we've convinced ourselves these behaviors are things a good employee does? That's because as instant gratification monkeys, we are naturally adept at getting wrapped up in the micro and ignoring the macro. We inherently ignore the big picture. I'm going to sign back in from home tonight and work on some stuff. This is an actual group chat message I've seen time and time again. This is called lowering the limbo bar. This is a capital offense. This sets an expectation for the rest of the team to meet your, quote, performance. You're not only burning yourself out, but you're helping burn your team out. Nice going, overachiever. This isn't college, it's business. We don't work to impress, we work to make money. Number 4, we must stop being caricatures. And we must stop applying our generalizations to other engineers. I can't count the number of times I've privately cursed a developer who wrote code that caused a memory leak on a system that I'm responsible for. As a Twitch reaction, though, it's entirely possible that they imported a library that did this, a RubyGem or a Python module, something from NPM, that they themselves weren't directly at fault at all. Maybe it's easier for me to feel good in that moment by having a scapegoat to put the blame on in my own head. What do I mean by this? Well, let's look at an example. Here's an excerpt from the HAProxy 1.6 release notes. This is only cute if you aren't a sysadmin or DevOps, spelling you'll notice is wrong in the original docs. They say in their official documentation, now HA Proxy can send emails when a server state changes. Mainly goes down. So your sysadmin's Devos won't sleep anymore. Smiley. This isn't that funny. If you do any of the following things, you may be contributing to team burnout. After hours work, even when you're on call. Compulsively sending or checking work email while off hours. Instead of triaging an alert while on call, you work on the issue and document all of your work, create tickets, send emails to the team to explain what happened and how you fixed it. There's a time for this. The morning. And finally, you're contributing to team burnout if you change production systems after sundown or on Fridays. Why is this wrong? Microservices were supposed to save us from needing to perform maintenance late at night. Let's be the first people to use automation as a freeing technology instead of a method to get more work out of each human. Let industry competition provide that drive. We don't need to do it to ourselves. The truth? We all do these things at least sometimes. Who benefits? Not our teams. It's not cool. When we do this, we're being liabilities instead of assets to our teams. It takes emotional and professional maturity, which is gained via suffering the results of this behavior, to recognize this behavior. Psychology time. The 12 phases of burnout. Phase 1. The compulsion to prove oneself. Often found at the beginning is excessive ambition. The desire to prove oneself in the workplace turns into compulsion. Traits that are considered positive in a capitalist economy, such as ambition, motivation, a desire to do better, end up destroying us as individuals and sapping at our humanity. If being better at what we do is what we truly desire, then we'll educate ourselves about the risk of burnout and do everything in our power to prevent it from taking hold. Many people might consider this a waste of time until they realize that it's scientifically proven there's a discrete process of burning out. Prove yourself to yourself. That's true confidence. Because they have to prove themselves to others or try to fit in an organization that does not suit them, people establish high personal expectations. In order to meet these expectations, they tend to focus solely on work while they take on more work than they otherwise would. It may happen that they become obsessed with doing everything themselves to show they're irreplaceable. If life is a game, there are a few strict rules. One is, no matter how hard you work, if a company wants to replace you, they will replace you. It may be for reasons that are inappropriate, such as them just not liking you, but excuses will be made to make it fit within the law. A thick file will be made to prove you are incompetent. It may be completely false, but it will be enough and it will keep the company safe. Since they have to devote everything to work, they now have no time and energy for anything else. Friends and family, eating and sleeping start to be seen as unnecessary or unimportant, as they reduce the time and energy that can be spent on work. People experiencing this become aware that what they're doing is not right, but they're unable to see the source of the problem. This may lead to a crisis in themselves and become threatening. This is when the first physical symptoms appear. While falling into a state of denial of basic physical needs, perceptions and value systems start to change. Work consumes all energy, leaving none for friends and hobbies. The job is the new value system, and people start to become emotionally blunt. People may become intolerant and dislike being social. They may be seen as aggressive and sarcastic. Problems may be blamed on time pressure and all the work they have to do. Minimal social contact turns into isolation. Alcohol or drugs may be used as a release from obsessive working, quote, by the book. These people often have feelings of being without hope or direction. Coworkers, family, friends, and others in their immediate social circles cannot overlook the behavioral changes in these people. Terms like bio break are a comedic reflection of this stage. The very act of going to the bathroom becomes something that is an interruption to the work that could otherwise be getting done. We transform from being individual humans to problem-solving, task-completing machines. The scary part is there may be people out there who actually desire this behavior in their employees. Burnout may also include depression, and in that case, the person's exhausted, they're hopeless, they're indifferent, and they believe that life has no meaning. They collapse physically and emotionally and need immediate medical attention. In extreme cases, suicidal ideation may occur. with it being viewed as an escape from their situation. Only a few people will actually commit suicide. That's right. This is where people can actually die due to being overworked. It happens in Japan regularly, where it's called karashi, which can be translated literally as death from overwork. It's easy to make light, and it trivializes a legitimate problem. But the reality is, there are people out there right now, in our industry, who are contemplating suicide as a logical escape from work. I'd again like to talk about things we can do proactively to curb the behaviors that lead to the collection of symptoms known as burnout syndrome. Great leaders have a read on their people, and they know when to tell their team it's okay to stop. I'd like to talk a little bit now about behavioral contagions. Old habits die hard. You'll have that one person who insists they just need to stay a little longer to get something done. Maybe they follow the classic rule that it's a good idea to not leave until your boss leaves. They'll sit idly in a chair before getting up before their boss leaves. They may even go so far as to argue that you're somehow infringing on them for asking them to stop. Ignore them. These are dangerous habits that will hurt other team members by not raising but lowering that bar and forcing others to feel they too need to keep up with the unrealistic expectations set by a single offender. Great leaders curb behaviors that lead to burnout before they can spread to the entire team via behavioral contagion. Great leaders recognize when things like, quote, pager fatigue are starting to take a toll on the team, and they don't put the onus on the team to fix it. If people are constantly being alerted, they become hypervigilant. And if people are hypervigilant, they aren't able to focus on the real problems that need solving, and instead become highly paid watchmen and women. Eventually, this makes the time they're spending during office hours less productive, and eventually, they move on or fill a seat doing nothing all day other than waiting for pages to come through. The moral of the story is, as it is with so many fables, moderation is key. We cannot let our passion for technology take precedence over our loved ones, our physical and mental health, and our long-term personal and professional growth. The tech industry is sick, and it is our duty to do something about it. Nobody will fix it for us, especially when the sickness is immensely profitable in the short term. There's no need for shame. Burnout can and often does lead to clinical depression. The important thing to realize is that this doesn't somehow make you broken. When it rains, the soil becomes wet. When the human mind is burned out, it becomes depressed. It is a chemical process that can happen to anyone. It's happened to me, it's happened to my good friends, and I think it's safe to say it happens across our industry. In an insane world, it is strength to ask for help, not weakness. It shows prescience and a desire for balance to ask for help, digging out of the hole, rather than accepting being in the hole as normal. Perform forensics analysis on what got you here. Remember who you are. Think about what motivates you before any self-destructive patterns may have hijacked your motivation and physiological reward systems. Treat yourself as if you are addicted to a drug and you're attempting to break free of its grasp, because that's exactly what depression and burnout is. It's a chemical phenomenon. Do you need to spend some time wandering aimlessly at local parks in the summer, even if it means forcing yourself to do it? Do you need to take up a hobby, even if it means you won't be good at it at first? If you lead a team, do these things for yourself. And when dealing with your people, trust that there's nothing soft about adding the question, how are you feeling, to your one-on-ones, if you're even having one-on-ones. You don't have to love the issues you're working on, but you should like them. Going to work every day and internalizing the stress of solving problems for other people is hard enough to begin with. So it's important to enjoy the entire process of work. Most of us enjoy that burst of dopamine we feel when we solve a new, novel problem. But if you're any good, you'll eventually be promoted, and the issues will get harder and take longer to solve, and the duration between those bursts of dopamine will grow longer. You have to like the issues you're working on too. They shouldn't feel like grueling work. If they do, maybe you're not yet in the right role. Maybe you enjoy the process of scripting, but find the process of configuring disks remotely tedious. Maybe you're more suited to being a team lead. Maybe you are a team lead and you're more suited to a role where you can work more closely with the technology. If you overexert yourself in any one area, it should probably be in finding your place in this amazing community. There are so many opportunities out there, you just need to look. When I demoed this talk to my wife, she reminded me that it was a lot like a Michael Jackson song, and I insisted, I don't know about that, but she insisted that I include a photo of him looking in a mirror in this slide, so somehow the king of pop is in this talk. The vicious cycle of burnout unfortunately brings with it poor decision-making abilities. If you're currently stuck in any of the patterns I've talked about, you are very likely not mentally fit to make sound decisions about how to get out of the cycle because you're running on empty. So how do we bootstrap ourselves into a better life? Humans are very good at writing off or rationalizing away difficult, voluntary tasks. So how do we short-circuit this temptation and start to improve ourselves and thus our industry? Personally speaking, last year I left the startup culture. I took a lot of time off before I made any rash decisions about where to go career-wise. I needed to press reset. You may not have the ability to do this financially. And if that's the case, I think saving for a few months before doing it is totally plausible and reasonable. It sounds completely cliche, but the fact is, you may need space to find yourself. I'm not talking about a cross-country backpacking adventure or a trip around the world. I'm talking about a month at home thinking about where you are in life and where you want to be, and how your career fits into that larger puzzle. Personally speaking, I've started working normal hours on a team of friends, doing work with attainable goals and healthy challenges. I try to work out multiple times per week, and I've already started shedding the 70 pounds of stress weight I put on when my misadventures started. This is the talk that I wish I could have given myself a decade ago, and I hope it inspires you to make a positive change for yourself and thus our industry. By the way, the Michael Jackson song is Man in the Mirror. And I'll end with a quote. The people who walk the long road are not the heroes who sprint for a few years and burn out. They're the people moving at a sustainable pace for decades. That was taken from Dave Hoover's book, Apprenticeship Patterns, Guidance for the Aspiring Software Craftsman. Thank you.